Hello and welcome. I'm Fahd Husain. Today we have a very special guest on the show. Famous author and Iran expert Dr. Vali Nasr will be joining me in the later part of the show. An interview you cannot miss. But first, let's begin with what has just happened. Because in a story like this, timing is not a detail. Oftentimes, it is the story. There are now credible indications from multiple diplomatic sources that American and Iranian teams could return to Islamabad for another round of talks as early as this week. Now, of course, this is not confirmed, but because multiple sources are reporting it, we are referring to this news. Now, just sit with that for a moment. Because at the exact same time, almost in parallel, the U.S. has launched a naval blockade targeting Iranian ports through the Straits of Hormuz. So on one track, warships are moving into position, rules of engagement are tightening, and the risk is rising. And on the other track, diplomats may be preparing to sit across the table again. If that feels contradictory, it should, because that contradiction is the core of this moment. And everything that follows actually flows from that. Let's break this down together, calmly, step by step. A naval blockade is not a symbolic move. It is not a signal. It is not pressure in the abstract. Under international law, a naval blockade is defined as a military operation intended to prevent all maritime traffic to and from a country's ports. That is the legal definition. And once you strip everything else away, what you are left with is simple. This is an act of war. Now, Iran understands that distinction very clearly. That is why its response has not been hesitant or confused. It has been sharp, calibrated, and deliberately open-minded. Warnings that if Iran's ports are threatened, no port in the region will remain safe. We are hearing these warnings. Warnings of retaliation, not just in one place, but across the maritime geography of the Gulf and beyond. And perhaps most tellingly, warnings of what they call new methods of warfare. That phrase is doing a lot of work because it signals something important. This is not going to be a conventional response, neatly contained, predictable or symmetrical. This is going to be indirect, layered, and designed to stretch the battlefield. Now bring that into the operational picture. American naval forces are now operating in one of the most congested, strategically sensitive waterways in the world. You have drones operating at multiple altitudes. You have anti-ship missiles deployed along the coastlines. You have fast attack boats capable of swarming large vessels. And in that environment, every single interaction carries risk. Not just escalation by decision, but escalation by mistake. History tells us those are the moments that spiral the fastest. Now here is where things begin to get a bit more complicated. Because even as this blockade has come into effect, it is already being tested. Ships are still moving through the straits, some turning back under pressure, some continuing forward, calculating that the risk is manageable. Even the numbers themselves do not align. Officials claim suggest that a much larger volume of traffic is under watch. Independent tracking suggests far less, which tells you something very clearly. This is not a clean blockade. It is partial, it is contested, and it is fragile. But, and this is the critical point, even a fragile disruption at this location has outsized consequences because nearly 20% of the world's oil flows through the Straits of Hormuz. You do not need to shut it down completely, you just need to disturb it. And we have already seen how that works in practice. When the Houthis targeted shipping in the Red Sea during 2023 and 2024, they did not close the route entirely. They did something far more effective. They made it uncertain. Ships rerouted around Africa. Insurance premiums surged dramatically. Transit times increased. Costs climbed up. And slowly but steadily, global supply chains tightened. That is the modern model of disruption. It does not break the system instantly, it bends it. stresses it, and forces adjustment that ripple outwards. Now connect that to what is happening today, because there is a growing concern, particularly among Gulf states, that this crisis may not remain confined to Hormuz. Reports in international media suggest that Saudi Arabia is actively pressing the US to step back from the blockade and return to negotiations, not out of sympathy for Iran, but out of concern about what Iran might do next. And what Iran might do next has of course opened a second front through, of course, the Bab al-Mandab. This is a narrow maritime gateway connecting the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. It is the main exit route for Gulf oil heading towards Europe. If that choke point is disrupted, you are no longer looking at pressure in one location. You are looking at a dual choke point crisis. Hormuz in the Gulf, Bab al-Mandab at the edge of the Red Sea. This is not leverage. This is systemic disruption. Before the Gaza war, roughly 9 million barrels of oil moved through Bab al-Mandab every single day. When the Houthis began targeting vessels, that flow dropped sharply and traffic never fully normalized. Even now, the system carries that residual stress, which means the infrastructure for disruption already exists. It does not need to be created, it only needs to be activated. And now bring this back to diplomacy, because just days ago, here in Islamabad, the US and Iran spent nearly 21 hours in negotiations. This was not symbolic engagement. This was detailed, substantive negotiation. A draft agreement was on the table, and the disagreement between both sides was not about whether to reach a deal. It was about how long that deal should last. 5 years or 20 years. That is not a disagreement about principle. That is a disagreement about structure, which means the deal itself was already within reach, and this process did not begin in Islamabad. Back in February 2026, quiet diplomacy had already been underway. Oman was facilitating back-channel contact. The Omani foreign minister publicly indicated that both sides were closer than they had been in years. Momentum was building, carefully, quietly, but unmistakably. And then came the escalation. Strikes, counter-strikes, and 6 weeks of sustained tension that has kept global markets on the edge. And yet, even after that, Islamabad happened. Pakistan stepped in, used its diplomatic capital, brought both sides back to the table, and once again to the edge of an agreement. So we come back to the central question. If a settlement was inches away, why escalate now? Is this a calculated move to extract concessions, or is it a misjudgment of how fragile the situation really is? Because escalation raises stakes, but it also reduces control. And that loss of control is already visible. The conflict is widening. Israel continues military operations in Lebanon. The northern front remains active. And inside Israel, something more subtle is happening. Public sentiment is shifting. There is fatigue. There are questions about the cost of this war. And those costs are not abstract. They are economic. Investor confidence, market stability, long-term fiscal pressure, and a prolonged confrontation with Iran carries the consequence that this could extend far beyond the battlefield. So there is pain in Israel. Now step back and look at the broader picture. Because this is not a conflict without exits. There are off-ramps. For Iran, the incentives are clear. Sanctions relief, access to frozen financial assets, economic breathing space after years of pressure. For the US, the incentives are equally clear. An opportunity to step back from a conflict that is becoming politically sensitive and economically costly, both at home and globally. Because this is no longer just about foreign policy. It's about energy markets. It's about inflation. It's about domestic pressure. Which means the real challenge at this stage is not military. It is political. How do you step back without appearing to retreat? How do you de-escalate without losing leverage? And how do you manage allies in a way that maintains cohesion? Because no ceasefire holds unless all actors are aligned. And that, by the way, includes Israel. Which means what is required now is not just a pause, not just another round of talks, but some kind of a framework, a clear, enforceable framework, where restraint is tied to consequences, where escalation carries a cost, where support is conditional on behavior. Because without that, you do not have stability. You have cycles, and cycles inevitably return to conflict. So now, bring this back to Pakistan. Because Pakistan has played a critical role at this moment. It has facilitated dialogue, it has brought both sides to the table, and it is continuing to engage regional actors, including Saudi Arabia, to sustain the diplomatic track. And here is the reality. Talks alone are no longer enough, not at this stage. What is required now is something more structured, more comprehensive, more durable, a solution that addresses not just immediate tensions, but the underlying dynamics. The world cannot continue absorbing repeated shocks from the same conflict. And that brings us back to the core truth of this moment. Talks did not fail, they stalled. And that means the choice still exists, escalation or resolution. And here is the line that defines this entire crisis. The closer diplomacy gets, the more dangerous escalation becomes. Because when peace is within reach, pressure begins to build. And when pressure builds, mistakes become more likely. But pressure also creates opportunity. And right now, that opportunity is still alive. The only question is whether the actors involved are willing to take it. To discuss the present situation, we today have with us a very special guest who is ideally suited to connect the dots and explain where we are today and where this situation could go. Dr. Vali Nasr is my guest today, needs no introduction, Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He is also a non-resident advisor, Center for Strategic and International Studies. And of course, he is the author of the best-selling book, Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History, a book which is a must-read if we want to understand the current situation. Dr. Vali Nasr, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me. Good to be with you.
So let's dive straight into the latest situation after the inconclusive round of talks here in Islamabad. Dr. Nasr, today there is a lot of chatter about a second round which could take place, and you have also tweeted about that. What are you hearing and what is your assessment? Could another round take place very soon?
Well, my reading of what happened in Islamabad was that there was substantial talks. I mean, the two sides do not talk at that level for 21 hours, way into the early hours, unless they were making progress and going forward. They didn't arrive at a point where they were ready to sign on to anything. And I think at that point the talks stopped. But we have to look at what happened in Islamabad not as a one-off event, but as a process. It's a diplomatic process. And the most important thing is that very clearly the United States and Iran, neither one really wants to go back into an open conflict and an escalation of violence. So they are both seeking a diplomatic end to the war. They're not seeing eye to eye on what that diplomatic end looks like, and each has certain demands. But the very fact that they want an end to the war means that ultimately they would have to have a negotiated settlement. So my expectation was that even after the talks broke down, there would be some saber rattling, as we saw with the United States deciding to blockade the Persian Gulf altogether and all of Iran's ports. Iran similarly threatening. But ultimately, at some point, they would come back to the negotiating table. Well, when that is going to be remains to be seen, whether it's going to be very soon or sometime in the later future. But there is a deadline for them, which is the 2 weeks ceasefire. And I think that puts more pressure for them to continue the process sooner rather than later.
And one indication that there could be another round of talks was the post by the Iranian foreign minister after the Islamabad talks, where he said that the two sides were quote unquote inches away from a deal. What does that suggest to you? That the basic blueprint is already there and it just needs a final push?
It suggests that they made substantial progress. In other words, there was not disagreement right at the go. Otherwise, they would have each gone home very early on, which means that they were able to basically move from their earlier positions, at least on a certain set of issues, towards the middle. Now, there are obstacles that they're not ready to sign altogether. We know some of them. For instance, the fate of the Strait of Hormuz is a sticking issue. We know that the fate of Iran's 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium is still an issue. And also at issue is Iran's desire to have guarantees that the United States would actually implement any deal that it signs. And it would not, again, leave the deal after it has signed and got what it wants from Iran. Now, it suggests to me that in principle, they believe that all of these issues are negotiable and that the positions can change, but they did not arrive at a final agreement that both sides could actually sign on to a memorandum.
And of course, such a signing would obviously entail a better understanding and appreciation of each other's positions. Dr. Nasr, on April 12th, you posted this comment. I'm just going to read it out to our viewers. You said that I told FT that during the past 2 decades of trying to get a nuclear deal, Iranians have never said they will not negotiate over their program, like they've said that we will never negotiate over missiles. The nuclear program has always been up for negotiation, and the terms have always been the same: sanctions relief in exchange for capping the program. The question has been the terms, the trust, and all of that. So how much of this do you think, understood and recognized by the American side? And could it mean that the negotiations on these points that you've mentioned could actually be the way forward?
Well, I believe this is exactly what was being negotiated in Islamabad. In other words, the program was up for negotiation. Under what terms would Iran stop enrichment, for how long, whether the United States would give up use of the term zero enrichment and find a diplomatic way of saying that Iran has the right but will not enrich. And then how will Iran get rid of its 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium? Does it go to the United States? Does it get diluted, stay in Iran? Does it go to Russia? When does this happen? I mean, there's a lot of details. But Iran started negotiating over its program all the way back in 2005, 2006. And then again, during the famous period where they got a deal under the name of JCPOA. And then again, they negotiated with the Biden administration in Vienna, and twice they were negotiating with the Trump administration when they got bombed. I mean, where the problem is, I think, is that President Trump is not actually interested in a deal. He's interested in surrender. And surrender is not a deal. I mean, we keep these things. When even at the end, before leaving in Islamabad, Vice President Vance said that they're simply not accepting our terms. Terms means a dictate, means that we're not changing our position. We're here to essentially receive from them acceptance of what we have demanded. And so that's not going to get them to a deal. But if the United States is willing to negotiate the terms under which Iran essentially suspends for the large part its nuclear program, that it doesn't enrich, that it doesn't stockpile, that it hands over its highly enriched uranium, but retains the right to enrich, which is under international law as a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it is entitled to, like any other country. And then it gets real, verifiable sanctions relief. Then you have a deal. It could be bigger, more expansive than what happened under JCPOA, but it's not going to be substantially different from JCPOA.
So then that means that the onus is on the US to recognize and appreciate the bargaining position of Iran and to also recognize that terms of surrender are unacceptable. The bigger question is that after the Islamabad talks, do you think such a realization will dawn upon the US negotiators?
Perhaps. I think the US negotiators know fully well what Iran's position is. Now they've had 21 hours at the highest level to actually go over those terms. The question is whether President Trump is willing to negotiate or is he still demanding surrender? And I think, one hope I think one has is that twice he decided in the middle of negotiations to bomb Iran in the belief that, okay, if they're not going to surrender, I'm going to bomb them. First of all, take away their leverage, which they had on in terms of a nuclear program in June of 2025. And then basically by bombing them since February, that they will realize that they are losing and they'll come to the table and surrender. Now, the shock for the Americans is not that they've all of a sudden realized what Iran's position is. The shock is that the war has not produced what the United States expected. It was not quick. The regime didn't fall. There was no popular rebellion in Iran. There was no anticipation that the Strait of Hormuz could be closed, that Iran could take the war to the Gulf countries and devastate the economy of the Persian Gulf, and that it's not willing to surrender yet. So Islamabad showed that even now, after 40 days of war, Iran is not ready to surrender. So I think it's not that the U.S. understands the terms that Iran has put on the table. The question is that does the United States come to a realization that Iran is not likely to surrender, and the cost of forcing Iran to surrender could be a much bigger, more devastating war that ultimately, yes, the United States power with great capability, it can destroy most countries around the world, and Iran's not an exception, but it will come at a huge cost to the United States itself and to the global economy. And so it is weighing those realities now that President Trump has to think about. In other words, at what cost are you going to get a surrender from Iran? And how long is it going to take?
So if that is not a realistic option, Dr. Nasr, which obviously most people believe that it is not, and obviously Iran also understands the situation. They're reading the situation very well, perhaps better than the Americans are. But they also understand that if they won't surrender, they also can't see America accepting defeat. So they have to somehow provide something to the Americans which President Trump can take and walk away and still not take a huge political hit. Is there anything like that?
Well, that's why they were talking about it for 21 hours in Islamabad. That's why they're going to go back over there. I think it's possible. I mean, obviously, President Trump has to define what victory means here. If he walks away from Islamabad and said, I got a bigger deal than Obama got, I got Iran to suspend nuclear enrichment for 30 years, that they're not going to be enriching. Yes, they have the right under NPT, but they're not going to exercise it. They're going to hand over their 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. And we have come to an agreement that under these circumstances, the Strait of Hormuz is going to open up. Then, yes, he can claim victory. But if he anticipates, like he did at the beginning of the war, that he's going to get a total victory, I mean, his maximal positions are going to be realized, 40 days into this war, that's not the case. So he has to settle for lesser goals and define victory for himself and the American population in a different way. Because the other side of it is that the longer this war goes, the more he would be under pressure to justify the costs of this war. Let me give you an example. He came out of Islamabad. I mean, his conclusion of Islamabad talks was to say, I'm going to impose a naval blockade on Iran, almost under the assumption that this will only impact Iran and nobody else will be impacted, and Iran is going to immediately come to its knees. Now, there is no indication that Iran is immediately willing to surrender because of the blockade. But we see that China is already, for the first time, showing very direct unhappiness with the U.S. policy, saying that they expect that their maritime trade with the Persian Gulf and with Iran in particular would not be affected by the blockade. So the U.S. has created a China problem. Then Saudi Arabia is reported that it's telling the Trump administration that it needs to go back to Islamabad instead of the blockade, which means the Saudis are also not happy with the blockade. So the costs are coming to the United States from different directions. And if the blockade goes longer, and for instance, also extends to an Iranian retaliation using the Houthis to disrupt trade over the Red Sea and Bab al-Mandab, the impact on the global economy would be much higher. I mean, we haven't really tallied the fact that how many other countries around the world are being affected. There are parts of Africa where the price of fuel and diesel has already doubled or tripled. There are parts of Africa that are running out of food. The disruptions in global trade is impacting a lot of countries around the world. And the longer it persists, you're going to have a combination of inflation and recession that's going to do long-term damage to the global economy. And so, in a way, President Trump's pursuit of maximal goals, given that he's not been able to force Iran to collapse or to surrender, is impacting more than Iran. So it's not only Iran that's under pressure, increasing the United States under pressure.
That pressure that you're referring to, Dr. Nasr, also obviously translates into which side has more leverage. And of course, that's a debatable point. But if I were to frame it in a different way and just ask you, if you look at the position of Iran when it was negotiating the JCPOA compared to the negotiations that it was doing in Islamabad over the weekend, at which time do you think Iran was or is in a better position to have a negotiation with the United States?
I mean, diplomatic negotiations are always a matter of each side weighing what it can achieve and what is its leverage. Iran clearly has more leverage than the assumed Iran would have at this point. And the United States still has considerable leverage here. But neither side is going to have a total victory here. And both sides need a diplomatic outcome here. I think there are two things that are different from the time when they negotiated JCPOA. One is the issue of trust, which means that Iran negotiated the JCPOA, it signed it, it implemented its part of the deal. Whether it was a good deal, bad deal, from Iranian point of view, from American point of view, the deal was implemented. The United States never really implemented the deal, even under President Obama. Not many sanctions were lifted. And then the United States basically pocketed what Iran gave up and then walked away from the deal and imposed even heavier sanctions on Iran. Then Iran was negotiating with President Trump twice, and in the middle of negotiations, they get bombed. So and even we saw that even the Iranian delegation coming to Islamabad and going back home had to be protected by Pakistani Air Force. So that to you suggests that there's a trust factor, which didn't exist in 2015. And also now Iran has also performed in this war using the Strait of Hormuz, using attacks on its Arab neighbors and their economic infrastructure in a way that has given it a kind of leverage that the United States did not assume Iran had in the war. And finally, the amount of damage that Iran's economy has suffered since 2018 because of maximum pressure, and also because of the scale of the bombings of Iran's infrastructure over the past 40 days, raises a threshold of what Iran would accept. In other words, Iran is not going to accept a deal that basically returns it to where it was before the war. In other words, under maximum pressure sanctions, its skies open to Israeli and American attack, and then its populations pour angry to rebel. And now that it's gone through this 40 days of war, it's really looking for a deal that fundamentally changes the situation that it's in.
My conversation with Dr. Vali Nasr continues. We have to take a short break. When we come back, much more to talk with Dr. Nasr. Hopefully there won't be another round of war, which means that we have a small window for a couple of days before the deadline for the ceasefire ends, and which is why we are hearing here in Islamabad, Dr. Nasser, that the Pakistani leaders are now indulging in very hectic diplomatic activity. The Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif is heading off to Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar also. The role of Pakistan, of course, you've been following Pakistan very closely, and you were also here a couple of months back, and you won over many new fans. Let me just add that. So the way that Pakistan has been able to become the main broker, have the two sides come here, do you think it retains that role, and that in the coming days, if we need to have some breakthrough before the ceasefire deadline ends, that ultimately Pakistan will have to retain the role that it has been playing in the last couple of weeks?
Well, the role that Pakistan is playing, if we went back 2 years, 3 years back, we would have never predicted this. We never would have predicted that Pakistan would have this kind of an influence with the Oval Office directly through its leaders. And we wouldn't have seen Pakistan having the initiative or the audacity to play such a kind of a role. But there's a story here about Pakistan itself that at some point, it needs to be told. But I do think that now Pakistan has arrived at a place of playing a very significant role in this. It has gradually come into this role. It really starts, if you would, with its signing of a strategic defense pact with Saudi Arabia, which connected much more to the fate of security in the Persian Gulf. Regardless of why that deal was originally signed, it was not directed at Iran only. It was also directed at Israel's attack on Qatar. It was a reaction to that. And then as a consequence of that deal, gradually Saudi Arabia began to form around that deal a broader diplomatic quartet, if you would, including Egypt and Turkey as well, as a way of creating a new force in the Middle East that would be both a counterweight to Iran, but also a counterweight to Israel. Now, all four of them engaged the United States very, very actively before the war in order to persuade it not to engage the war. Now, in that connection, I would say that the two people who had much more direct access to President Trump among the four leaders of the countries that I mentioned was Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and it was Pakistan's leaders, both General Munir and Prime Minister Sharif, who could talk directly with President Trump. But they were not able to prevent the war. And then very quickly after the war, Saudi Arabia convened a meeting of the four foreign ministers of these four countries, first in Riyadh, and then they met again in Islamabad. And ultimately, Pakistan emerged because of its connection with Washington, because of its connection with Beijing, which is also very important in this process, and because of its connection with Riyadh, as the country that would actually be best positioned to move this forward. And I think one of the achievements Pakistan had here was to actually build a relationship of trust with Tehran, which had not historically been there. In other words, the countries were very friendly, were very close to each other, but they were not as close as, let's say, Iran and Oman have been. After all, Pakistan had historically been closer to Saudi Arabia and times when Iran and the Saudis had no relations. Pakistan was always sort of seen more in the Saudi camp than the Iranian camp. And so they're not natural allies. And during the Afghan war, the decades of Afghan war, Iran supported the Northern Alliance. Pakistan was supporting the Taliban. But in this past month, the Pakistanis have established a kind of relationship of trust with Iran that has made this very, very possible. So Pakistan is the only country right now that has relations with all of these four major actors here, which is Saudi Arabia, which is the most important country in GCC, with Beijing, which had a big role in persuading Iran to come to Islamabad, with Iran itself, and with Washington itself. And then the talks in Islamabad went very, very well. I mean, the Pakistanis played a very important role in keeping it going. The fact that they went on for 21 hours has already made them a historic event. Iran and the United States have not talked directly since 2015. They have not had this long an interaction at this level. At the vice president and Ghalibaf is head of Iran's parliament, but is a much bigger figure than that. And now again, everybody's turning back to Pakistan to see whether they can restart the talk. So as you and I are talking, there is no other game in town other than in Islamabad. There's no other alternative. And so if the two countries, Iran and the United States, still want to move forward, that they need to do it through this channel that has been established in Islamabad. And you can see the prime minister going to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, which is engaging a group of key countries around providing regional support for this. And probably they're talking directly to Washington and Tehran at the same time, and to Beijing. I think it's all very, very important. So it's a very historic moment for Pakistan as well. And one shouldn't discount that, regardless of what the outcome would be. And I would say this. Pakistan is not responsible for whether Iran and the United States can arrive at an agreement. What Pakistan can and has done is to do the maximum to facilitate these talks, to make it happen, to build a relationship of trust that that the messages can go back and forth, and that it can help mediate this. But in the end, it's up to Iran and the United States to see their way to a deal. It's not Pakistan's responsibility.
But everything points to the need for a deal. And I think, as you're also saying, obviously, Iran wants a deal which it can live with. The Americans also want something that they can walk away with. So, and the alternative is the worst possible option, escalation. In that sense, the blockade that President Trump has initiated may be a tactical move to strengthen his hand at the next round of negotiations, possibly. But that next round of negotiations, whenever that happens and wherever that happens, will have to build up on the round that happened in Islamabad. As you're saying, and a lot was actually achieved by having these people face to face for 21 hours. So clearly, that kind of builds a certain better understanding of each other. So my question is, with Pakistan being the only game in town, as you said, what arguments would or could Pakistan be making to the Americans and the Iranians and perhaps the other concerned countries to try and bring the sides back again, preferably to Islamabad, and have another round to ensure that the ceasefire doesn't break?
I mean, the role of a mediator is to faithfully communicate between the two sides, is not to have its own opinion. Because then it becomes a party to the talks. And Pakistan is not a party to the talks, and it shouldn't be a party to the talks. It should faithfully try to create the most conducive situation for the two sides to come back to Islamabad. And that means that to not only faithfully pass information around, but also, if necessary, sometimes make useful suggestions, etc. But it should not have its own position here. That it believes this, believes that should happen, or U.S. should make this compromise, or Iran should make that compromise. Because then, as I said, then it loses its objectivity, and it loses the trust that both sides have in it. So ultimately, I think what Pakistan is doing right now is basically socializing and the talks with the region, consulting with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar. Those countries can in turn talk to Iran on their own and talk to the United States on their own. They can give ideas to Pakistan. Pakistan then can relate this to both sides. And ultimately, Pakistan basically has to help bring the two sides back together, and then create the most conducive environment for this to happen. There's something, and I say this as an aside, but there's something here that is important, and Pakistanis perhaps would appreciate. the pressure that Iran is under, and people wonder why it doesn't buckle. And does Iran have a higher threshold of pain, or the United States? Reminds me of something that Zulfiqar Ali Bhutto said decades ago when Pakistan was building its bomb. He said, we'd rather eat grass. I mean, we're willing to eat grass, but we're going to build this bomb. I mean, if you have a country that is willing to tolerate enormous amount of pain, then that is leverage itself. I mean, the United States can put blockade on Iran, can bomb it, but ultimately the Iranians are counting on the fact that their threshold of pain, their willingness to suffer to get to the ends they want, is higher than that of the United States. This is not about who has bigger bombs. This is about who has more endurance and pain toleration, and who is more determined to get to where they want. And I think Pakistan understands this in its own history. And perhaps that's also something that has built relationship between them and Iran, and is something that they can convey to Washington as well, in terms of what Washington's expectation of escalation against Iran may mean.
And this bridge Pakistan has built with Iran and of course with the US. I mean, these two relationships, as you were mentioning, we haven't always had very solid ties with these two countries, but the last couple of years, we've invested in these two relationships, and those investments are now paying dividends. Whenever the conflict ends, looking ahead a little bit, what kind of a diplomatic dividend could Pakistan foresee based on the role that it is now playing in this conflict?
Well, I think it will make Pakistan a much more important Middle East country. Pakistan has always been on the edges of the Middle East. It's not been part of its regional politics. It has had economic relationships and along its labor and technology and business relationships with the Gulf countries. It is part of the Muslim world, and to that extent, it has been involved in the Middle East. But it has never before been this engaged in a major Middle East political issue. That's number one. Secondly, I think Pakistan's involvement in the Middle East is coming at the expense of some of India's similar involvement in the Middle East. I mean, it's very clear that the other South Asian country that has had very deep economic relations with UAE, with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, is very much sidelined in this engagement. And I do think that, secondly, I would say that Pakistan is going to become far more important to the security of both the Arabian Sea and the Persian. I think that this is now putting, when Saudi Arabia and Pakistan signed their strategic defense pact, everybody thought about nuclear umbrella or Pakistan's military support for Saudi Arabia. But what has been deployed is actually something very, very different. Is Pakistan as a diplomatic, if you would, as a diplomatic heft in the middle of the most important consequential war that the Persian Gulf has experienced. And ultimately, it is, I think, lockstep with Saudi Arabia in particular in this endeavor. And so whatever comes afterwards will make Pakistan very, very important in managing Saudi-Iranian relations, in managing security in the Gulf. And thirdly, and this is going to be very interesting, that in carrying out this diplomacy, Pakistan is actually has to manage an issue that has been on the horizon since it's got closer to the United States, which is how will it balance its relations with Beijing with those with Washington? It has very deep economic, military, diplomatic, political relations with China. And it is now building a new and highly influential relationship with Washington. China and the United States clearly are not on the same page, and they have a lot of conflict, and the United States is not at all happy with the Chinese playing a bigger role. But Pakistan has very cleverly also deployed China here. I mean, before the Islamabad talks, the foreign minister went to Beijing. It solicited China's help in building ties with Tehran and persuading Iran to come to Islamabad. China is the silent voice behind the curtain, if you would, in these talks. The Iranians want the Chinese more involved, and if that happens, I think the kind of relationship that Pakistan has with both Washington and China will become very important to the future security of the Gulf. And some of this will translate into, goes beyond the Iran issue. I mean, after the war, Pakistan itself has to really think through how it's going to manage its own newfound situation. I mean, the prominence, success, being thrown into the limelight the way Pakistan has, it's really good. It could be a moment probably Pakistanis would celebrate, but it comes with also new challenges and responsibilities. So the question becomes, what does Pakistan do with what it's gained out of these out of brokering peace and ending largest, most consequential war in the Persian Gulf region?
Dr. Vali Nasr, it's indeed a pleasure, and I would just, before I thank you, I would like to say that if more people in Washington DC and Tel Aviv would have read your book, perhaps this war would not have happened. There's a certain realization of the lack of understanding of the adversary, which could have been cured if they had read your book. Very grateful for you for joining us today, and looking forward to speaking to you again. Thank you. And that's the full frame for tonight. See you tomorrow.